What's going on, guys, and welcome back. This is episode number 4 in this drag and drop series that I'm doing. This is actually the functionality that we're building for this series. So if this is the first time or the first video you're watching in this series, definitely head back and check out the first 3 where we go over just the beginning portions of this. And this is actually where we are now for this video. So we don't have any of our images showing up in our titles yet, and when we drag this around, we can let go of it, but it's still going to keep following us around because we haven't actually set up, the mouse down or mouse up functionality in this case. And what we're going to do is actually just start with getting the images and the titles to show up because we haven't actually done that yet. So let's jump in and let's take a look at where we are right now. We have a couple of functions that we still haven't defined. I kind of have everything minimized here so we can see what's going on. So you'll see we have our init and we have these functions here, but we're missing a couple in here. Like we have our, so we'll put this so we can see. So we have our grouping here of these 3 functions, and we're still missing our arrange items, our mouse up, our move items to slot, and even our get image by ID function that we still don't have either. And so the purpose of this function is what it says basically. We're going to be getting an image by passing in an ID, and by getting an image, what we're meaning is we're going to be getting an object from the image library. So if you remember, this is our image library right here, and basically we're going to be passing in one of these numbers, and we're going to expect to get back this whole object. And the reason we need that is because we need to know what image and what the title is to actually show those on the screen. So let's look at the function that we're doing here is basically just running through a loop and finding that image and then returning it when it finds the image ID that matches right here. And actually we'll write this function, but we're going to write it in a different way. This might be helpful for you guys because we're going to use, some built-in array methods so we don't have to actually, loop through like this. So let's call our getImageById function here, and this is going to take an ID, of course. And so in here we're going to actually return, and then we're going to call that image library, and we're going to call a function called find. This find function is going to take a function, and this function inside of here is actually going to take a property, and we'll just call it image because we're going to be looping through the image library in this case. So now what we want to do is from this find method, we want to return where the image.id equals the ID that we pass in. And so this, oops, just jumped to the top. Okay. So this is actually, obviously look at how much simpler that is than writing out all of these lines. We just have this basically written in these, couple lines here. So it's a little bit shorter syntax, but it works exactly the same way. So that's just 2 different methods you can use if you want to perform some kind of functionality like this. So now that we actually have that function set up, let's jump back into our draw images function, because this is actually where we're adding that background image. So if we take a look, there's our inner HTML that we're adding, and if we look at our left side, you'll notice that our HTML string is a little bit shorter than it is over here, and that's because we still haven't added those couple things that we need. So now that we have this new handy function, we're actually using it in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable at the top called image, and then we're going to set that same way we did with our ID. We're going to be setting that inside of our loop, and we're going to be calling that getImageById function, and we're going to be passing in the image ID, which is the image ID that we're currently working with. So what this is going to do is it's actually going to find us that image by that image ID. And if you remember, the image ID is coming from this array up here at the top. So we've got this array of IDs defined, and it's either going to give us one of these numbers or it's going to give us a -1 if it doesn't find the number at that index. So what's going to happen is now our image is going to get set to the object that it finds at that ID, but if it's -1, then it's just going to come back with undefined, which is fine for us because we're just going to check to see, do we have an object or is it undefined, and then we can basically set the values based on that itself. So if we look on our right side, you'll see that that's what we're doing here, is we're setting a style for the actual background image, and we're adding the URL only if the image actually exists. So in this case, what we'll do is inside of our string that we've created, we can create a new style tag, and we'll open this up, and in parentheses, we're going to check to see if image exists. So basically this is just checking, this is saying if there is an image, in this case just making sure it's not undefined. We're going to then open another parentheses because we need to create kind of a string here for the background image itself. We're going to do a background image, and we're going to set the URL equal to our images dash, and then in this case we're going to break that string again, and we're going to put in the image.image, because what that's doing is essentially if we have access to these objects now, we're getting the image property right here, which is going to give us this name. And then that's pretty much all we have to do here. And now what we can do is just outside of this parentheses here, we'll just do an or empty string. So if the image is undefined, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to set a background image for it because it doesn't have one, basically. And then so next we're basically just doing the same thing with the title. So right now we just have testing title in there, but if we actually just change this and instead put in our if image is defined, we want to use the image title in this case, or just an empty string, which works for us as well. So now let's take a look at what this looks like. So you'll see now we've got this showing up, and we've got obviously an error because it's not finding the images that we have set. And the reason is just because the folder that I have in our file structure is actually called images. So this is where our images are all sitting right here. And I called it image instead of images by accident. So if we just make that change, I can refresh it now, and you actually see these images show up on our screen. So obviously this doesn't look right because the images are way bigger than these boxes, and that's why we need to go in and actually set a CSS property that will allow that to show up correctly. So if we take a look on our right side, what's actually happening is that somewhere we have a background size. So on this DD item inner, we have these properties set for our background. And so on our item inner, we actually already have those properties set up here as well. Oh, but they're being overridden by this right here, because this was just in there temporarily while we were not seeing those images, but now that we're seeing those, we can get rid of that. And then now you'll notice that that background property isn't overriding our styles for the other backgrounds that we have set. So cool, now we have the images and the title showing up. All we have to do is finish the remainder of the arranging item functionality that we have. So let's actually jump down now and take a look at what's next in this. So we should be able to close up the draw images because we're kind of done with that function for the moment. And let's take a look at the remainder of our image move function, because there's still some functionality inside of here that we don't have set up yet. So I'm going to kind of minimize some stuff and clean this up a little bit. So inside of our mouse move on our left hand side, this is our working copy, we are missing this chunk of code right here. And this is actually what arranges those items around as we're moving one of them around. And so before we can actually set that up, there's these two functions that we don't have defined yet that are actually being called inside of here. And so the first thing that we'll do is set up that move item to slot function, which is actually a pretty simple function. It's actually simple enough that it probably doesn't even need to be its own function. I could probably just keep this one line inside of the code itself. And I might actually do that in this case just because it'll be easier for us. So instead of defining a new function, let's first go in here and we're going to create an if statement. So what we're checking for first is to make sure that this slot or this hover slot ID is not equal to undefined. And the reason we're checking that is because obviously if we're not hovered over a slot currently, like for instance if we jump over here and we're dragging this around, if we're not hovered over a slot, there's no slot IDs over here or any other places around here, which means that that hover slot ID is going to be undefined right now as we're dragging this around. So that's why we need to check for that. We need to make sure that there actually is a slot that we're hovered over before we do anything. So that's the first thing we're going to check. And then we're also going to make sure that the last touched slot ID does not equal the hover slot ID. And so in order to do this, we need to create that variable that we're referencing. So this was another variable that we were creating up top that we haven't created in this new version over here. And I believe I just defined that right here. So I'm going to do that last touched slot ID. And this tells us where basically what the last slot we hovered over was. So now inside of here, we're checking to make sure that that slot, that last touched slot ID, does not equal the hover slot ID. And what that does is it basically prevents this from being called a bunch of times. Because obviously if we're dragging around, if I jump onto this slot, you're going to be on this slot for this whole time you're moving around. It's going to be firing that function unless we make that call in the if statement to make sure that those IDs don't match. Because this whole time those IDs will match, and then as soon as we move to a different one, it'll be a different ID. So those two checks are the only things we need to make inside of this for that if statement. What we're doing here is obviously when we hover over a new slot, we want to make sure that we set that last touch slot ID equal to that hover slot, just so that this if statement can actually work properly. Otherwise, if we weren't updating this variable, then it wouldn't really work the way we wanted it to. So we're going to first add that in. So we're going to set that last touch slot ID equal to the hover slot ID. So now this line that we need to add, basically we're going to grab the listed image IDs, and we're going to use a splice method on this. So we're going to, in this case, we were using new slot, but new slot is actually our hover slot ID, which is what we're passing in for that new slot. So in this case, we can just use that hover slot for the new slot variable. And we're going to be saying we want to, at this index, we want to be inserting basically a new value. So this 0 is saying that we don't want to get rid of anything right now. We just want to add something. And so what we want to add is actually the result of that same array, but now we're going to call another splice, and we're going to use that old slot, which is actually the new index variable that we're passing in. And we're going to be removing one item, and then we're also just going to be, because this returns an array, we're going to be getting the first item that it removes at this array. And so this might look kind of confusing because of the way we're writing it, but what this does essentially is this splice right here will return an array of items that we removed from the array. So the idea is this tells us where we should start, and this tells us how many items we want to remove. So we're removing the old item from the old index, and we're taking the array of the items that were removed, because remember that's what this is giving us. And then we're accessing the first item, which there should only be one because we're only getting one. And then we're just basically inserting that same value that we just removed. We're inserting it into a different location inside of this array. So it's basically this portion removes it, and then this portion re-adds it in a different location. And then before we go any further, obviously we have to define the next function that we're working with. So our arrange items function is actually what handles the moving around of all these items once we actually drag them around. So if we jump up and actually look at what arrange items does, we can start setting up some of this functionality. So I'll minimize this, and let's get us right here now under our draw images, and we're going to create a new function, and we're going to give it that arrange items name. And now we're going to look over here and see what we're doing. So we're actually running through a loop of the listed image IDs, and what we're doing is actually setting the transform based on the slot that image currently occupies. So let's start writing some of this functionality. So we're doing I equals 0 first, and we're defining just some of our variables at the top that we're going to be using. So we have our listed image IDs dot length as the length of the array, and then we're also just defining a slot and an element inside of that array, or that for loop that we're going to be running through, and we'll be writing that now. So while I is less than length, we are going to be, in this case, first we're grabbing the actual slot. So we're going to be grabbing the image slots at the index. So this is just going to run through, slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, and so on. And we're going to figure out which items are currently associated with which slots. So first we'll set that slot value equal to that image slots value that we have defined up here. And now we're going to set that element equal to the doc, and we're going to do a query selector so that we can find the element based on its data attribute. So right here we're going to be doing data image ID, and we're going to be looking for the element that has the data image ID of the listed image IDs at the current index that we're running through. So basically this is going to find us the element that has the image ID of the listed image IDs at the index. So in this case, this is our actual array that we have, And remember, while we were moving around, we were editing this array and we were moving things around in the array while we're dragging around our image. And then we need to redraw based on the new order of this array. So now that we have that information, we can now just take that LE and we can add a new style based on the slot that it's associated with. So we can add a new transform and we can set that to the translate 3D. And again, we'll start with our basic 0, 0, 0, and then we'll jump in and we'll add our value, which is actually the slot that we have, and that's going to be the X value for there. And then, of course, we're going to have our Y value for our slot here. And like I said, I won't bother adding our other supports for WebKit and MOZ. But this should now be enough to get this function working. So if we jump back down to our mouse move, we can then add this function into our bottom like we're doing here. So we're just going to call that function after we've rearranged our array. So now we're going to call our range items function, and now hopefully this is going to work for us. So let's give it a shot. So if we jump into Chrome and let's refresh, if we start to drag this around, there we go. So it's already working super well, which is cool. So all we had to do was just add in the functionality where we rearrange the array and then we just tell the image which slot it needs to be in. And then our CSS transitions are actually handling all the animations for us. So all we have to do is just give it a new X and Y location, and then the transition will just take care of the animations for us, which is super handy. Now, the only thing we have left to do that we haven't set up is that obviously I'm not holding down my mouse button anymore and it's still following me around. So we need to set something up for that. So let's jump back to our code, and this is going to be the last function that we actually need to make here. So let's kind of minimize some of this so it's a little easier to see what's going on. And so we added that arrange items function, and now we need to add our our image mouse up function. So this function has a few things in it. Basically what we need to do is, well, let's first define this function. So we have our image mouse up function, and we don't need to worry about our event property on this because we don't really need to use it for anything. The only things we need now is when you let go of the mouse, we need that selected image element to reverse the classes that we did, the class changes that we made when we first moused down, or first called the event mouse down. So in here, if you remember, we had these two, and actually what I can do is just copy both of those and paste them into here, because we're literally just going to be changing this to add and this to remove. So we're basically just doing the reverse of what we did there, because we want to put the classes back the way they were now. So after we've done that, now we know that that selected image element has our transition class again. So now we can call to set the selected image element to null because we don't need it anymore, and we want to make sure that this knows that we're not clicking on any elements anymore. And then we also just want to set those click position chords back to null as well, which actually isn't necessary just because, you know, we're not using it anyways if it's not clicked on anything. So really you just have to make sure that this value is set back to null. And then we're just going to call our range items that one last time to make sure that all of our items are in the right place when we let go of the mouse. So now that that one last piece is in there, we just have to make sure it's added to our actual items. So if you remember, we added our mouse down listener here inside of our draw images function. And we're basically just going to copy this line, and we're just going to add an up in this case. So we have our mouse down and our mouse up functions bound to this item. So let's actually take a look at the final product now. So if we jump over here, I should be able to refresh, and I should be able to drag this around, and I should be able to let go of it now and have it just float into its correct slot based on where you're currently hovered. And it looks like it's working perfectly. Alright guys, so this has been awesome. I'm glad that we were able to build this in vanilla JavaScript. I've been messing around with some really cool technologies lately, but I still do love working with just plain JavaScript. It's just really fun to build this kind of stuff from scratch and show you guys how to actually do that. So if you guys are only familiar with frameworks, at least you have some experience with some, vanilla JavaScript programming. If you guys have suggestions on more videos you want to see that are like this, or like something else that you want to see a tutorial on, be sure to leave a comment down below and leave this video a like. That helps me out a lot. And if you guys are enjoying the content so far, definitely be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next series. I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing next, but I'm sure it's going to be cool. So stick around and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.